So today I want to briefly talk to you about some very basic but very important concepts in designing a research project. And all of these are things you need to think about when you plan your final paper. This is something that researchers consider before they start doing a study. And these concepts that you hopefully by now have read about are units of analysis, conceptualization and operationalization, and levels of measurement. They may be more or less relevant to you depending on whether you use qualitative or quantitative research, but to some extent they are relevant to everyone. So I decided to cover them now before we venture into specific research methods and research designs next week. So after we cover these in this brief video, I will ask you guys to complete a few activities on the Blackboard page. And then, of course, email me or contact me during class time using the live chat option if you have any questions. So we're going to start by talking about units of analysis. This is something that a researcher thinks about very early in his or her research process. A unit of analysis is simply what or who you study. And another way to think about it is the person or object about whom you are getting your information. So in your sample, when you collect your data, every point of data, every case of data is going to be either a person or a dyad or a group of people or an organization or an object or a social artifact. And so most communication researchers study individuals. For example, today you are going to read an article by one of our communication faculty, by Denise Polk. And in this study, Dr. Polk and her colleague looked at the ways in which people show love to their partner. It's actually a very interesting article. I recommend that you read it. It's something that is relevant to really almost everybody's life. And so in finding out how people show love to their romantic partner, they they gathered information from individuals. They had 110 students involved in a romantic relationship in participating in their study. And in most cases, we collect information about individuals. So every point of data in our sample that we collect is a person, and we looked at this person's responses. Sometimes, however, researchers choose to study dyads. So we are interested about what happens in a couple of people. For example, what are the main ways of or strategies for communication used by the married couple, or what are the main behaviors used during conflict resolution by married couples. If you remember, we talked about research by John Gottman when we talked about your research interests, and he studies married couples and the behaviors they display when they talk about their problems. And by observing these behaviors and taking note of them, he's able to predict how likely it is that a couple will divorce. So every point of data in this data set, in a study like this, would be a couple. So we're not really interested in individuals here. We're interested in what happens at the level of a couple. So this is the unit of analysis, or dyad. The professional term for this type of unit of analysis is dyad, two people. Very frequently, we also study groups. There are plenty of naturally occurring groups in the society, and there is a field of research called group communication. For example, some researchers study how groups reach decisions. For instance, how long it takes a group to arrive at a decision. And so they might conduct an experiment where they create groups in the lab, and every time they perform the observation, they have a group of people in the room and they give them a task and they ask them to resolve a problem or make a decision, and then they can measure how long it takes the group to make a decision, and look at a bunch of other characteristics of their behavior. But the point is that at, at any point in time, one data point in this data set would be coming from a group, not from an individual person, because then we would not be getting this information that we want, which is group behavior, but from a group of people. And so there are plenty of groups that people can observe in real world, like church groups, family groups, friendship groups. And what happens within a group is very different to what happens between just two people or one individual. So whenever you are collecting information, excuse me, about what's going on in a group, that is your unit of analysis. Then a more formalized type of group is an organization. Public relations research, organizational communication research involves looking at what goes on in organizations, and very frequently researchers sample organizations, and they obtain information about each organization in that sample. For example, researchers who study public relations frequently look at the strategies that companies take in response to some PR crisis. For instance, when a company releases a product and it turns out to be faulty or even dangerous to consumers, what does the company do to save its image and resolve that crisis? And so a researcher could go on, look through perhaps a news database, and find accounts of companies going through public relations crises, and then perhaps contact those companies and ask to speak with them how they handled that crisis. And so each data point in this set of data would be an organization, not a person, not a dyad, not an informal group, but an organization. And finally, researchers extensively study social artifacts. Social artifacts are simply things that are made by people or used by people that somehow teach us something about those people. Of course, in communication research, those social artifacts most frequently are texts, different types of texts that people produce. So we study things like newspaper articles, or we study movies, television shows. I do research on YouTube videos, which also are social artifacts. So in my case, every point of data in my sample that I collect is a video. I sample videos and I study, I obtain information about what's in the videos. So anything that people make, web pages, t-shirts, clothing, absolutely anything that you could study in terms of its meaning is considered a social artifact. The meaning of the word artifact is simply an object. So these are units of analysis, and you have an activity that lets you test your understanding of this idea by giving you some examples of other research studies and asking you to identify what would be or what is the unit of analysis in each of these cases. Now, you may recall this visual, this image. It's from your textbook, and specifically from chapter 4, and it shows how researchers work. There are two directions in which a researcher can work: deduction or induction. And today we are talking about a specific point in the wheel of science, and that is developing concepts that you as a researcher are interested in, and then deciding how you are going to measure those concepts. And this is the term conceptualization and operationalization. And just to show you where we are on this wheel of science, we are about here. When we talk about developing concepts, concepts are building blocks of theories. So conceptualization usually happens around here, but also proceeds through here. When you develop research questions, you think about concepts. And then when you move on and decide how you are going to measure those concepts, how you're going to study them by collecting data, you are moving toward observation. So we are on this side of the wheel of science, more or less. Most people have ideas about what things are. And most of us have some kind of a definition for a lot of things in the world. That individual subjective definition that we have, that personal mental representation of any phenomenon in the world, is called a conception. So for example, if you think about it, probably all of you would be able to give me a definition of what lying means or deceiving somebody means. And each of you may have a slightly different definition of what lying is. And that is because it's based on your personal background, your knowledge, your experiences that you have had with lying, and your emotional responses to lying. There are people who feel maybe somewhat indifferent toward lying, but there are people who vehemently hate lying and hate liars. So it differs from person to person. And that's a problem, because when we get to research, because it's not good enough to use your own conception of something when you are about to study something. Why isn't it good enough? Think for a moment. Did you think for a moment? Well, it isn't good enough because people who are reading your research or who are going to try and do something similar to what you are doing may not completely agree with your idea of a concept, for instance, of what lying means. May not understand what you mean by what you're saying, especially if you use a lot of emotional terms. For instance, lying is a horrible thing, and it's evil and I hate it. It's not really a very thorough, systematic way of describing the world that research is known for. Remember that the way of knowing in terms of research is very different from knowing based on casual observation, or knowing based on tradition, or knowing based on authority. It is grounded in very systematic, very detailed, very thorough definition of things and description of things. So you start your research process by very clearly and thoroughly defining what something means, and you cannot base your definition only on your personal ideas of what the meaning of something is. And so we may begin, and you may well begin your research study by thinking about things that are important to you, and you think in terms of conceptions, what things mean to you in terms of human communication. But then very quickly, when you start researching them, you should move on toward concepts. And that move toward concepts is called conceptualization. Conceptualization is the process of specifying what we mean when we use particular terms, and specifying it in painstaking detail. This process, conceptualization, occurs through a dialogue among researchers, and it results in a concept. Now, how do researchers hold a dialogue amongst themselves? Most commonly, it is through the articles that they publish in academic journals. I have an article for you to look at that accompanies this video presentation by Duran. It was published, good 20 years ago, and it deals with communicative adaptability. This is sort of a characteristic that some people have developed to a greater or lesser extent. This is the ability to adapt to communicative situations. And you can see that in that article, if you look through it, he spends a lot of time in the beginning specifying what that concept means. And when he specifies what that concept means, he makes references to many different researchers who have studied this idea before him. And he summarizes what all of those people say about communicative adaptability. And so By doing this, he is effectively having a dialogue with them, having a conversation with them, brings them into the table, brings their opinions into the table. And so this results in a more well-rounded definition of an idea, and that's all that conceptualization involves. So when you have provided a very clear research-based definition of something, you have provided what we call a conceptual definition. And so now we know what you mean, and we're no longer thinking in terms of conceptions, we're thinking in terms of concepts. So don't be confused. We have used a bunch of words that sound very much alike, but they are different. Conception, once again, is your personal, private definition of something, and we all have them. Conceptualization is moving from your personal conception to a concept, and you do that by looking at what other researchers have said about a given phenomenon, pulling their definitions and ideas together, and summarizing them, so we come up with a more complete and well-rounded definition of that concept. And that complete and well-rounded definition is called conceptual definition. If you have any questions about this, if this is still confusing, let me know. Now, some concepts are more complex than others. Some concepts are fairly simple. For example, attitude toward the Banana Day. Whether or not people approve of the Banana Day being held on campus is a fairly simple concept. It just has one sort of area of meaning, one dimension. But there are concepts that are what we call multidimensional. So for example, in the Duran article, which focuses on the concept of communicative adaptability, defined as the ability to adapt to different communicative situations, he isolates 4 different dimensions or aspects of this adaptability. You can be adaptable to different communication situations in terms of your social composure. That is, how relaxed you are, how at ease you are in different situations with people. You can show your adaptability through your use of humor. If you know when to make jokes, and you are able to use jokes effectively to release tension, to make people feel comfortable with you. And you know how sometimes people will make inappropriate jokes at the worst of times. That's this dimension, this one aspect. While these people may have really good social composure, they feel relaxed, but they say the wrong things at the wrong time. They may not faze them at all, but it may offend others. So you can see both these things, social composure and wit, are 2 different dimensions, and they may be independent of each other in some people, but they're both dimensions of the same idea, the same concept, communicative adaptability. Then we have articulation. This is your ability to clearly spell out the words and phrases and sentences that you're using, so that people can easily understand you. And some people speak more clearly than others. And to some extent it's a skill, but it's also a natural ability to adapt to your listeners. If, for example, I'm talking to someone who comes from a foreign country who doesn't speak very good English, I make extra effort to articulate my words clearly to them so that they can understand me. And appropriate disclosure. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of TMI, or too much information, and how some people tend to just tell you everything about their lives, even the most private details that could be embarrassing to the listener, but they still tell them. So some people do not know what the appropriate amount of disclosure or information is in a given situation, and they can't really adapt well from one situation to another. So these are all 4 different dimensions of the same concept, communicative adaptability, and many concepts in communication are like this. Later in today's class, you're going to see another study that involves a concept that has many dimensions. So it's important to think about these things, because when you come to measure the concept, when you come to decide how you're going to capture the concept in research, you have to make sure you capture all of those different dimensions. You have to have measures of all of those different dimensions so that you get a complete picture. So not only do you need to define your concept clearly, but you have to think about it. Is my concept unidimensional, fairly simple and straightforward, or multidimensional? So does it have many different aspects? I'll give you another example of a concept that can be considered multidimensional. That is love. Love has many different areas, as you know, or there are many different types of love. There is romantic love, there is platonic love, there's family love, there's love toward your pet, and these different kinds of love are just that, different, but yet they are all grouped under one umbrella term, love. So once again, we're looking at different dimensions of love. And if you want to try to capture the different kinds of love that people feel in their lives, you have to account for them. You have to make sure you include them in your measures, whatever you are using to measure that. Speaking of which, operationalization. That term refers simply to describing how your concept will be measured. So so what you do is you simply tell your readers in your paper, and this is what you will be doing in the methods section of your paper, how you will measure the concept that you have defined in your literature review. So in Duran article, if you look at his methods section, he gives a very clear operational definition of his concept. Operational definition is simply a description of how the concept was or will be measured. So here he says a measure consisting of 60 statements was used to measure communicative adaptability. 10 items were written for each of the 4 new dimensions, and 10 items with the highest loadings were selected to represent the existing dimensions. The items were constructed as 5-point Likert type statements. Now don't worry about all the technical terms that he uses, like loadings and Likert type statements. We will talk about that later. You don't have to worry about it. Just know that this is a description of how he was measuring, how he measured communicative adaptability in his study, and this is what we call an operational definition. And the process of operationalization simply involves sitting down and deciding how you will measure something. And remember that a lot of times researchers borrow measures from one another. So if somebody else before me has already measured a concept in a certain way, I may want to basically take his or her operationalization and use it in my study, because it saves me time. That's one thing. So I don't reinvent the wheel, but also it creates some kind of continuity in research. So the research community at this point is using similar tools for finding information, and that makes the information we find comparable. And so it's not like, you know, everybody's doing his or her own thing, and we can't put everything together in terms of our findings, but we are using similar research tools, and so it's easier later to compare our results because they were obtained using similar research tools. So finally, after we have talked about the units of analysis, the conceptualization and operationalization, I want to talk about one finer point of measurement, or specifically operationalization, deciding how you're going to measure something. This is really relevant to those of you who will be using quantitative research methods, so either a survey or an experiment or a content analysis, more so than those of you who will be using qualitative research methods like participant observation, interviewing, or qualitative text analysis. But it's important to talk about them now, because I don't know what you will decide to use down the road, and I want you to understand these basic principles here. If you measure things quantitatively, and measurement, remember, is the process of converting your observations into categories or numbers, you can do so at 4 different levels. So you can have 4 different levels of sophistication when you are observing or capturing your concepts. And your book also talks about this in some detail. And they kind of are ordered from the most simple, which is nominal, to the most sophisticated mathematically, which is a ratio level. And I'm going to give you examples of variables that can be measured at each level, because typically any variable you measure, and variable is just a more technical term for concept. So anything that changes is a variable, and we measure those things in quantitative research. Any variable can be or lends itself into measurement at one of these levels. Sometimes you can measure one variable in several different ways or at several different levels, but typically variables kind of have properties that make them easier to measure at one or the other level. So I have some examples of variables here. We have gender, graduation year, attitude toward orange juice, and number of hours spent watching television. And each of these variables can be measured at a different level. Let's begin with the nominal level. Nominal level measurement involves categorizing variables into levels or categories that are different from each other, but they are independent from each other, and they are in no mathematical relationship to each other. So for example, gender, it has 2 levels, or it has 2 values, right? Male and female. But neither of them is greater or stronger or bigger or better. They're just 2 independent values like this. So if you are male, you are not more than a female. If you are a female, you're not more than a male. And if we assign numbers to these, or if you want to use numeric codes for these values, like, I don't know, male is 1, female is 2, 1 and 2 doesn't mean anything. You can't calculate an average of gender, for instance. You could just as well assign 355 to male and 5070 to a female, and it doesn't mean anything. These are arbitrary numbers. So the nominal level of measurement involves assigning or looking at categories of variables that are independent of each other in mathematical terms. Another example is hair color. We have blonde, we have red, we have brown, we have black, we have gray, and all of these are just different levels. There's no hierarchy among them, no mathematical relationship. The next level of measurement is ordinal. And think about that name, ordinal. It has something to do with ordering. And more specifically, it involves ranking the levels of a variable that we're measuring. So in this level of measurement, ordinal, there are different categories of a variable that are actually rank ordered from the weakest to strongest, from the lowest to highest, from the worst to the best, such as in the question, do you like orange juice? And you have 3 response options, ranging from 1, hate it, to 3, love it, and 2 being somewhere in between. What is important about this is that although these are ordered in terms of magnitude, we don't really specify any specific interval between them. So 2 is more than 1, 3 is more than 2, but again, these are just numbers that are arbitrarily assigned. You could as well just use 1, 22, and 133, as long as, you know, the middle number is higher than the first number and the last number is higher than the middle number, because all you are showing here is the order in which these categories appear. But we really don't look at specifically at what is the distance between hating something and neither hating nor loving it, because how far away are these 2 things? And then neither hating nor loving something and loving something. Again, we don't specify what is the interval that separates the 2. So ordinal level involves rank ordering values of a variable. Another example is if we rank order people on the list of American Idol contenders. or saying the extent to which you disagree or agree with a statement, ranging from 1 strongly disagree to 5 agree strongly. And then we have the interval level variable. In fact, interval and racial variables are very similar to each other.